Oh, okay, welcome back. Sorry about that. I got a little caught off there. But basically, I think we were done with talking about Oedipus. The last thing I was just going to say is that Levi Strauss thinks we should look at multiple versions of a myth, although he also says it's not possible to collect all of them. So we got to do the best we can with what we've got. But multiple versions lets us understand more deeply than just looking at one. Okay, so I want to talk about some other things that Levi Strauss gets into, and we'll kind of work through his process a bit more here. You might have seen this image from the book, and I just found it so confusing what they're even trying to do there with that particular chart, why there's labels on both the top and the bottom in the book's version and all that. So I decided to kind of recreate that chart and get across what I think Levi Strauss is trying to say. So this is all to do with the Zuni myth of coming up out of the earth, which, as you might guess, is kind of some of the inspiration for Levi Strauss's thoughts on coming up out of the earth in different mythologies. Basically, in this story, instead of just two pairs of opposites, we kind of have three, as far as I can tell what the chart is trying to do there. So, again, they're in sets of opposites. So on the one hand, we have agriculture. On the other hand, we have war and hunting kind of being related to war. Then we have these hero twins who kind of appear throughout various Native American mythology, including the Zuni and the Pueblo and the Anasazi. This idea of these twins who are heroes in some way or important to the culture. And some parts of the story, the heroes are harmed, and in other parts of the story, the heroes are honored and the most important figures in the society. Then we've got life for the Zuni people and death for the Zuni people. So those would be our three oppositions. Growing things versus war, honoring the hero twins versus harming the hero twins, and life for the people versus death for the people. So it sort of suggests that all of these things exist in a relationship to each other because we have these multiple sets of opposites. So again, Levi Strauss, and he doesn't go clearly into detail on all this. I wish he kind of would. Sometimes one of the problems with him, I think, is that he doesn't explain all of his thought process. But what I think his thought process is basically we have, again, a myth with these same sets of opposites. So the myth tells the story of people coming up out of the earth and then learning to plant foods, learning to hunt, and to go to war with each other. And the hero twins help them do it, help them with migrations, but also sometimes help them with food and things like that, but are also sacrificed at times. Okay, so let's look at these opposites here. So agriculture is the opposite of hunting and war. Okay, so in agriculture we've got plants used as ladders to climb up. We've got plants giving you value as food, plants giving you value when you plant them in the ground and grow them, and you've got just some thoughts on agriculture. Then here we have war, which is recurring in the same way that agriculture is recurring. And hunting is kind of like war in that you destroy lives in a certain sense. Then you've got honoring the hero twins versus harming the hero twins. Honoring them, you've got the hero twins are figures who lead people up out of the earth. You've got two sort of clownish twins being the leaders for this migration. And you've got twin war gods being the leaders of the war. And these aren't always necessarily the same two twins. When we get to Carl Jung, we're going to talk about archetypes, how sort of similar ideas can appear in the myths over and over again. But here, throughout the Zuni myth, this idea of twins seems to be an idea that recurs over and over again, that these twins have a powerful role to play in the society. But sometimes the twins are related to harm or they're harmed themselves. For instance, the origin of water in the world is when a brother and sister commit incest. There's that incest theme again. Maybe we can connect that to Oedipus in some way. But that's the origin of water, which people need to survive. So a bad thing has to happen for people to survive. Another one, there's going to be a flood that's going to drown out the Zuni. And in this one, a brother and a sister are sacrificed to avoid the flood. In another story, they're adopted by another family in exchange for grain. And again, in a fourth story, they're sacrificed to gain victory in war. So there's this opposition where both extremes seem to happen at the same time. And then there's also life and death. Things that give life to the Zuni people include winning this contest with this other people, the Do people, over food sources. So they win the contest and they learn where all the food is. And then they find the center of the world. That's the migration that I was talking about. They find the center of the world where they settle down and they establish their tribe. And that also provides life for Zuni people. But the gods are also hostile to the Zuni people. They kill people by drowning. And there's also a war against another group of people, the gardeners, the Kian Kwe, and that leads to a lot of death. So these themes are sort of agriculture versus war, honoring the hero twins versus harming the hero twins, and life for the Zuni people versus death for the Zuni people. And I think if we were to look at that sort of A is to B, C is to D pattern, we might come up with 6 things. So agriculture is the opposite of war. Growing things is the opposite of killing things. Honoring the hero twins is the opposite of harming or sacrificing the hero twins. How do we feel about these twins? Are they good? Are they bad? Is it good that we honor them? Is it bad that we sacrifice them? Or is it good that we sacrifice them? There's this ambiguity there. So ultimately, this seems to come down to a theme of life versus death. And so Levi-Strauss would say you can use that opposition between life and death to understand all the rest of it. You can get this much more deep investigation into the other things like agriculture versus war if you understand that this is an echo of this idea of life versus death. And so really with the hero twins, they are these powerful figures who are kind of ambiguous. They can lead to great outcomes in either direction. And they're important to the society, but they are also themselves tied up with life and death. So that's why Levi-Strauss says, you might wonder why are we harming them when they are the helpers. That might be because they are connected to both life and death. And because of that, they're going to be connected to both agriculture and war. Now, you might wonder if there is a way of sort of mediating between all these things. And I think Levi-Strauss says that there is. But it gets us into looking at some more stuff here, and to lots of different Native American mythologies. So this is kind of hard to see. My upload wasn't that great here, but we'll do the best we can with it. Basically, Levi-Strauss says that in all these different Native American cultures, and maybe even in all cultures around the world, there's this feeling that there's this opposition between life and death. And then from there, you can kind of build a similar opposition between agriculture and war. And now, why does that make sense? Well, agriculture, growing plants, farming is another way to say it. That's associated with life, right? It involves creating life, bringing it up out of the ground, and then you get to eat food, and then you get to go on living. So that sounds pretty good. Life in agriculture are pretty closely connected, so that works pretty well. Then you have death and war. So death and war are opposites. No, sorry, are the same because war involves death. War is about killing people. That makes sense. Okay. So is there something that's in between agriculture and war? Well, in the previous chart, and I'm basing this mostly on the book, so maybe that's part of why it's a little confusing here. In the previous chart, we had hunting as being similar to war, but maybe in some ways it's also different. For instance, hunting, unlike war, lets you get food to survive. Hunting is about getting something that you can eat, unlike war. So while it does involve killing like war, it's also like agriculture in that it allows you to produce food and survive. So hunting is really associated with both life and death. So agriculture and war, they have something mediating in between, which is hunting. This activity, which is a big part of people's lives, especially in an ancient Native American society like the Zuni. So you can't really mediate between life and death. I mean, you can imagine that you could, but it's what is in between. Zombies? Well, we don't have that in this mythology, so it doesn't really work. But maybe somebody could try doing it that way. But Levi-Strauss says that these things kind of get displaced into our subconscious, which is a subject we'll talk more about soon. Levi-Strauss says these things kind of go to the back of our minds. And so just like with Oedipus, where there's this anxiety, people live and then they die. How do you reconcile that? How do you deal with those completely different states? Well, one way Levi-Strauss says is thinking about hunting, which is sort of touches both life and death and allows you to mediate in between. And by saying that the hunters are those who are in between the farmers and the warriors, hunters can be both farmers and warriors. That allows us to have more peace and less anxiety about life and death. And then similarly, you can take that out even further. So we're going to talk more about this when we talk about tricksters, but Levi-Strauss's definition of a trickster is a mediator figure, a character who is significant in a mythology because they are in between categories, and that allows them to be a mediator for all sorts of different anxieties. And Levi-Strauss asked the question, okay, why is it that in so many Native American mythologies, the trickster figure is either a coyote or a raven? And he says because coyotes and ravens are in their own way kind of in between. So he says there's an opposition between herbivores, animals that eat plants, and animals that eat meat. Predators would maybe be a better way to say it than they have it in the book. Predators versus plant eaters. There is something, in a sense, kind of in between. Animals that don't hunt their own food, but they do eat meat. So the raven and the coyote, they go around and look for carcasses that other animals have killed, and then they eat those. So they eat meat, but they don't go out and kill things. So that puts them kind of in between. So Levi-Strauss would say herbivores are the opposite of carnivores, and ravens and coyotes are the sort of animals that are in between. And that makes them like hunters, because hunters are kind of in between growing food and going to war. And you can kind of see a connection between agriculture and plant-eating animals, and war and violent killing animals, like mountain lions and things like that. So what Levi-Strauss says is that the raven and the coyote are trickster figures who can soothe our anxieties about life and death, because even though they don't have any direct connection to life and death, they're connected to this pair of opposites, which is connected to this pair of opposites, which is connected to this pair of opposites. So you can spread this out in so many different directions. Basically, I would kind of argue that every time you have a set of opposites, you can do so much with it. You can basically say that any set of opposites is like any other set of opposites, and any mediating figure can mediate between almost anything as a concept in the culture. And so this is a thing that mythologies use a lot to solve a lot of their different problems, and just sort of get people back to feeling all right and sort of establish what's normal and what's the values of the society. Now, the weird thing about tricksters is frequently they go outside of the values of the society, but what they leave behind is kind of examples of what to do and what not to do. They kind of help people think about all these things. So here we have that opposition between life and death, and we also have something kind of similar going on in the Zuni emergence myth, where we have three different pairs of opposites. This is the opposite of that, this is the opposite of that, this is the opposite of that. So this pair is like this pair is like this pair. And that way, they're all like each other. And maybe the mediating thing would be sort of ordinary life and things like hunting instead of war or agriculture. The hunters can mediate between life and death, and the hero twins can mediate between life and death, and also war and agriculture and all that, because the hero twins are in between. They have their feet in both categories. Okay, so in my next video, I'm going to talk some more examples that aren't in the book and maybe just get more comfortable with all of this, because it's weird. But that's basically it for the Zuni and whatnot. Okay, catch you guys in the next video.